The road to fame is paved with good intentions, but for me, it was lined with endless rows of rotting cornstalks and the heavy, suffocating silence of the American backcountry. About 15 years ago, I was convinced I was going to be the next big name in comedy. I had never been much of a student, but I could always make people laugh, so I skipped the traditional route of college or a steady job to pursue the intoxicating high of a cheering crowd. For nearly a decade, however, the only thing I was famous for was bombing on stage in dive bars and open mics. It was a brutal grind, driving hours across state lines just for 5 minutes of exposure that usually didn't even pay for my gas. One evening, an opportunity arrived that felt like the break I had been waiting for. A competition 5 hours away with a $1,000 prize, and more importantly, moderately famous comedians serving as judges. It was my chance to prove I had actual talent. My car was a piece of junk, and my cell phone was an unreliable brick, but I was determined. I left early, knowing my tendency to get lost, and set off into a landscape that quickly dissolved into nothing but vast, open farmland. My lack of preparation caught up with me quickly. I had winged it instead of double-checking my MapQuest directions, and soon I was deep in the backcountry with no idea where I was. I eventually rolled into what barely qualified as a town, just a few dilapidated buildings stretching a couple of 100 feet. I stopped at an old gas station to ask for directions. The people outside were not welcoming. They looked beaten down by life, their eyes cold and their manners short. After a tense exchange, they pointed me down the road, claiming I'd eventually find the turnoff I needed. As I pumped my gas, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. 4 of them were standing perfectly still, like statues, watching me with dead-eyed stares. The air felt thick with a weird energy, and I got out of there as fast as I could. I tried to shake it off by rehearsing my set, even wondering if I could turn that creepy encounter into a bit for the show. Not long after leaving the town, a beat-up white pickup truck roared past me, disappearing into the distance. I didn't think much of it until the sun began to dip below the horizon, and the trees on either side of the road seemed to close in. Suddenly, a violent thud erupted from beneath the car. The steering wheel jerked in my hands as I fought for control. I pulled onto the shoulder, my heart sinking. It wasn't just a flat, both of my front tires were shredded. When I leaned down to look, I saw the culprit. Several large nails were impaled deep into the rubber. Panic hadn't set in yet, mostly because I was furious that I was going to miss the competition. My cell service was nearly non-existent, but I managed to reach a friend to describe my location. As the light faded and the cold began to bite, I decided to stay in the car. That was when I saw them in the rearview mirror, 2 bright headlights cresting the horizon. They stopped a significant distance behind me and just sat there, bathing my car in a harsh, annoying glow. 5 minutes passed. The car didn't move. Then slowly, the lights began to creep forward, inching toward my bumper. Simultaneously, another pair of lights appeared in front of me, approaching fast. The vehicle in front screeched to a halt inches from my hood. My eyes were still adjusting to the glare when I realized the truck in front was the same beat-up white pickup from earlier. Before I could even process the trap, a loud, heavy bang rattled my driver's side window. Standing there, his face pressed against the glass, was the rude man from the gas station. He began to pull aggressively on the locked handle, his movements frantic and desperate. I was no longer worried about my comedy career. I was worried about surviving the night. The situation had devolved from a frustrating roadside breakdown into a calculated ambush. Through the glare of the headlights, I could see the man's face clearly. It was the same individual who had been so short and rude with me at the gas station earlier that afternoon. His hands, calloused and stained with grease, were wrapped around my door handle, jerking it with such raw violence that the entire frame of my old car rocked on its shredded tires. He wasn't shouting demands or asking for money. He was simply focused on the singular, terrifying task of getting inside the vehicle. Just as I prepared to scramble into the passenger seat to escape him, another figure materialized in the beams of the white pickup truck. The second man from the station had moved to the other side and began his own assault on the passenger door. I was trapped in a metal box, surrounded by a chorus of heavy grunts and the rhythmic, deafening thud of fists against glass. It felt like being hunted by something that didn't quite understand how to use tools, yet possessed a terrifying, singular drive to reach me. For a heartbeat, the man at my window stopped. He pressed his face closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface, and stared at me with those same vacant, dead eyes I had noticed at the pumps. The silence that followed was far worse than the pounding. Then, without any warning, he unhinged his jaw and let out a sound that will haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. It wasn't a human shout of anger. It was a high-pitched, animalistic howling that seemed to vibrate through the very seat beneath me. It was a signal. Adrenaline, sharp and cold, finally broke through my paralysis. I knew the windows wouldn't hold much longer under that kind of pressure. I didn't have a weapon, and my cell phone was useless for an emergency call in this dead zone. I I realized that staying in the car was no longer a defense, it was a coffin. I waited for the man to lean his full weight against the door again, timing my movement with the rhythm of his pulls, and then I acted with everything I had. I threw my shoulder into the door with every ounce of strength I possessed. The heavy metal door swung outward with a sudden crack, catching the man off guard and sending him sprawling backward onto the gravel shoulder. I didn't stop to look back or check if he was injured. I bolted toward the tree line, the darkness of the woods appearing like a sanctuary compared to the exposed trap of the road. My lungs burned as I hit the brush, the sound of my own footsteps muffled by the carpet of pine needles. As I breached the first line of trees, a desperate plan formed in my mind. If I ran blindly into the deep forest, I would likely trip over a root or run into a ravine and be caught in seconds. Instead, I made a split-second gamble. After sprinting only about 15 feet into the thickest part of the brush, I threw myself flat onto the damp earth. I tucked my body behind a large, fallen log and frantically pulled handfuls of dead leaves and forest debris over my jacket to mask my silhouette. I held my breath until my chest felt like it would explode, praying they would think I was still running deeper into the woods. The sound of pursuit followed almost immediately. I heard heavy, frantic thumping on the forest floor and the snapping of dry branches. I could hear them breathing, that same erratic, wet grunting, as they crashed past my hiding spot, heading deeper into the blackness of the timber. I waited, counting the seconds by the painful thudding of my own heart against the ground, until the sounds of their movement finally faded into the distance. The comedy competition and my broken car were gone. All that mattered now was surviving the 2 miles of pitch-black road between me and the hope of a passing stranger. I remained pressed against the cold, damp earth for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining to catch any sound over the frantic thumping of my heart. The woods were no longer silent. The distant crashing of the 2 men moving through the underbrush served as a grim reminder of how close I had come to being caught. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, they would realize they had overshot my position and would double back to search the perimeter of the road. I had to move now while the darkness and their own momentum were on my side. I began to crawl, moving inches at a time to avoid snapping any dry twigs. Every rustle of a leaf sounded like a gunshot in the heavy night air. Once I felt I was far enough away from my initial hiding spot, I rose to a low crouch and began to navigate parallel to the road, keeping myself hidden within the thickest part of the tree line. I didn't dare step back onto the asphalt where I would be a visible target in the moonlight. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, praying for a sign of civilization, a porch light, a silo, anything that suggested life. After about 40 minutes of grueling trekking through the brush, my legs trembling from exhaustion and terror, I saw a flickering amber glow in the distance. It was a small, solitary farmhouse tucked away behind a row of ancient oaks. I didn't run toward it immediately. I had learned my lesson about the people in this area. I approached with extreme caution, staying in the shadows until I could see a porch light and a well-maintained vehicle in the driveway. This didn't look like the dilapidated shacks I had passed earlier. I took a deep breath and sprinted across the open yard, pounding on the front door with a desperation I had never known. An elderly man opened the door, his expression shifting from confusion to genuine concern as he saw my disheveled state, covered in mud and leaves. I managed to stammer out that I had been run off the road and was being followed. Without a word, he pulled me inside and locked the door, while his wife immediately went to the kitchen to call the local sheriff. When the authorities finally arrived and escorted me back to my car, the scene was chilling. My vehicle was a total loss. They had smashed every window and shredded the interior upholstery with knives. But more disturbing was what the sheriff found on the ground nearby. There were several lengths of heavy-duty zip ties and a roll of industrial duct tape discarded near the rear bumper. They hadn't just wanted to scare me or rob me, they had been prepared to take me somewhere. The sheriff's department eventually linked the men to a string of disappearances in the region, but by the time they raided the small town and the gas station, the group had vanished into the vast, unforgiving backcountry. I never did make it to that comedy competition, and truthfully, I never performed stand-up again. The high of the crowd was nothing compared to the cold reality of that night. I realized that some roads aren't meant to be traveled, and some silences in the countryside are heavy because of the secrets they are hiding. I moved to a major city shortly after, finding comfort in the bright lights and the constant presence of people. But even now, 15 years later, I never drive through rural areas after the sun goes down.